Hey everybody, it's the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and you are watching the weekly Wringer series here on clanofthegraywolf.com. Been a little while since our last meeting. That is all my fault, and of course none yours. However, there's been a lot going on, been a lot of things happening here in Commodore land that I think would provide full explanation. But instead of really figuring those things out, let us continue to drive on toward the 100th episode, which is fastly approaching. We're going to have to take a good long look at how that 100th episode is going to come out to play in the very near future. However, the other thing we're going to need to do is talk about today first. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the question I gave you last time, which was about controllers. I've got several of examples here just to kind of talk through them a little bit. I asked you guys about controllers last week. We're going to tie that thing up, put a little bow around it, and we're going to talk about your favorite controllers in the past. And I'm always going to do as I do in every video. I'm going to give you my opinion as well, tell you a little bit about how I think about this particular question, and then I'm going to ask you guys a question for next week, which I think is an absolute zinger. It's one I think that you're going to have to spend some time thinking about. One I have had on the list for a while, and I think is really good. It's one of those questions that I think philosophically we have to ask ourselves about the mechanisms, the really what they call the apparatus. That's what film people call it. The apparatus of video gaming. I want you to think about that for next time. I'm going to give you a question about that one that I think will twist your noodle a little bit there. All right, so as I always do, I begin the episodes with starting off welcoming those of you that have provided a comment for the first time, so are new to the comments portion of the program. Remember, comments are how the show continues to run. If nobody had commented on the first weekly Wringer, there wouldn't be this many of them at this point. There probably wouldn't have been 2 of them. The point is, you guys keep the show running. That is why we have the show. That's why the show continues to go. That's why I'm here right now talking to you. So if you comment, thank you very much. If you don't comment and you just like to watch the show, that's completely fine too. We definitely have a lot of fans out there that are silent viewers. I prefer to call them silent viewers rather than lurkers, because lurkers just has a negative connotation to it right off the bat, and I don't like that idea. Anyway, the point is, the new person we only have one person to welcome this week, but that's okay. You know, it ebbs and flows, folks. We have one new person to welcome this week, and that is Smelly586. Now, I guess Smelly586 would probably be better, or at least slightly better, than Stanky486, or, potentially, I don't know, Smelly286. I don't know, maybe, who knows. But Smelly586, welcome to you. 586 probably is not even represented or meant to in any way align with an x86 architecture. I probably just dreamt that up. Maybe it's a birthday. I don't know. I don't care. Welcome to you, Smelly586. Thank you for being a part of the Weekly Wringer. Now that that's over, folks, let's get to the conversation. I don't know why that took so long, or why that filled my mouth with so many words, but I apologize in advance for what will be probably the rest of this video. In any case, last time I asked you guys about controllers. With the announcements surrounding the Xbox One, or the Xbone, depending on what you like to call it, with the PS4 on its way as well, with full controller views for those systems having been processed, obviously, with the Wii U being out already. So we have this idea of what the next generation hardware is going to look like. What that has meant is we've seen the new controllers, we've seen some of the control mechanisms, including Kinect, things like that, for these systems and consoles as well. However, it really started to beg a question in my mind, because everything seems kind of loosely still based in the same idea. Even the PS4 controller seems kind of influenced, as it were, by, in my opinion, the Xbox 360 controller, which I think many people in the gaming industry have already kind of posited is the greatest video game controller of all time. So I threw that question back to you guys. Is it in fact the best video game controller of all time? Lots of great answers to work with. I'll start with some of the things that you guys came up with very early on, which is, or that kind of ran through, I shouldn't say it early on, but then ran through the whole argument the whole way through. First is that I think most of us, if not all of us, would consider either the Super Nintendo controller, the SNES controller, or the 360 controller to be the best of all time. Many of you out there also put down there the PlayStation, DualShock, whatever you want to call it. That is also in the running. I would consider that to be in contention as well. In any case, I would say any one of those three I think is probably up there, because there's certainly a lot more of them than there were of anything else, I think. But also, they are just plain flat out more comfortable. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Several of you put that in your notes and in your thoughts this week, of which there were many. But I think most of us probably, when I look through the comments and when I look around kind of what people's favorite controllers are, those three, the 360, the SNES, or the DualShock for all of the PlayStation, the various and sundry PlayStations there have been since 1995, pretty much the same. Those seem to be everyone's favorites of all time. Now there are certainly different things that come along the way. We'll talk about some of those as well. But I think what is undeniable, I think the next thing I was going to say is that the Super Nintendo controller is probably the most influential video game controller of all time. I think that's something that came throughout the conversation as well. I could not agree more about that. I think it definitely is. And if my question was most influential, I think you guys just answered it. Also, several of you put the idea that Sony sticking to its guns over the years, really having pretty much the same controller design, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It really kind of, it isn't, necessarily the lack of embracing of change. It's more that they found something that works really well and they stick with it because it works. Can't argue with success. They've certainly sold a crap load of those guys, and I think they will sell a lot more. Even though the new DualShock controller, the new Sony controllers, they actually, I think, are a lot more akin to an Xbox 360 controller, which is why I think they'll be better moving forward. But I'm introducing my bias and talking about what I think is the answer to the question. So I will instead go down that road. I will talk about your contributions. So let's see. Red Mage got us kicked off in that really saying a couple things. One is that the SNES is probably the best blueprint for a controller that anybody has ever seen. The 360 really kind of executes on the vision of the Super Nintendo. And so here we go, right? Everybody knows this guy right here, the Super Nintendo and the Super NES controller, right? Is probably the blueprint for every controller that comes after it. I think there's good reason for this. Remember, Nintendo's coming from the NES, which had small. I actually do have an NES controller. I didn't bring every controller I have in here. I just decided to cut it down to my favorites. The NES controller, remember, is completely square. It gets kind of uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, I remember back when I was playing a lot of Nintendo, people were saying that you could get Nintenditis, right? Playing the game and being repetitive and just mashing buttons, and all of a sudden you'd start to feel lots of pain in your wrists and carpal tunnel and all this kind of stuff. It was small. First of all, it was kind of made for kids. Second of all, it really only had two buttons. Two buttons as in right here, and then of course it had a start and select button, and that was that, and a D-pad, which is almost exactly the same as the D-pad on the Super NES, except this one tends to be more rounded off. I remember, I have maybe more sensitive hands. I don't play guitar or anything, so I don't have calluses on my fingers, but I remember playing the NES controller and getting kind of it would like cut in. I'd get a little, an NES mark on my thumb, and you could actually start like cutting yourself if you were holding it down. The SNES was so much better than that. It was rounded off, and so you could get an imprint on your thumb for popping onto the old, I don't know if you can see that, popping on the old SNES, but it always went away, and it was so much more smooth. And there was kind of like a little membrane underneath the D-pad on the SNES controller, and I found that to be the most satisfying part of it. you never felt like you were ever gonna. It felt so well made. That's the best part of the Super Nintendo controller, as I can see. It's so well made. You never feel like you're going to break the thing in half. I mean, you could just sit there and crank on this thing, and it's not going to go anywhere. The addition of the shoulder buttons is also hugely influential, and I think a lot of fun and a cool thing for video games. Even though they weren't hugely used on the SNES, you could tell that they were probably the least utilized buttons. In many cases, they actually performed redundant functions of what you could do with the core buttons, but the idea was planted. Instead of holding the controller kind of like this, you could actually just put your fingers right on top, and they're right there, no problem. Folks, the reason that I think Red Mage talks about this as the blueprint is because you see it working perfectly, right? It's smaller, but it gets the job done. It's cheaply and easily made, yet it feels nice and compact and easy to, and very difficult to break, right? It's not going anywhere. The buttons aren't just kind of chunky and weird. They're smooth, they're round, and they work. You could probably dunk this thing in a whole bat of water, pull it right back up, and the thing would work perfectly. And you could throw it against the wall, and as I did many times, and the thing just takes a licking and keeps on ticking. So I think the SNES controller right off the bat is the blueprint. I agree with Red Mage 100%. Red Mage also talked a little bit about the Xbox 360 controller kind of carrying on that legacy and some of the things that it does well, and I agree with that. But I'm going to leave that for a couple future comments as well. Mr. K brought up a really cool point that I thought was completely legitimate, as he is one to do in the community in the past. The simple idea from Mr. K is really this: that there really isn't a best controller in video gaming, because that really is kind of a meaningless concept. For example, a controller for, say, a Castlevania type game is probably going to look a little bit different than the best controller for maybe a sports game or a driving game, right? Where other kinds of control are really needed in order to best control the game at hand. Also, Mr. K points out, it's also about anatomy, right? If you have smaller hands, then you're probably going to prefer a DualShock controller over, a larger controller. In fact, I have a comment about that in a little bit. The point is, there's no such thing necessarily as a best controller of all time, because of the fact that it's just out there. That there are so many kinds of controllers and so many kinds of games and so many kinds of people that really best is a difficult thing to categorize in any stretch of the imagination. And I agree with that. But that's, folks, it's the same reason why when you watch sports talk radio, while people ask, who's the best quarterback of all time, people get red in the face and scream about what their favorite is. It's the same thing, right? We're here to argue about it. We're here to talk about it and discuss it. That's why I have a show. That's in many ways why we have a website. That's what it's all about. So let's talk about it. Let's see. Smoke Pants gave, I think, the best breakdown analysis of the week. Really broke down the 360 controller but in many different ways. But I think one of the key contributions there for Smoke Pants is that and I agree with this, that for his money, the analog controllers on the 360 controller, which you can see right here, is really are the best. It is the best implementation on a controller that I have found. I think this is universally still true. I think the analog sticks, even on the 360, are better than the PS3 ones. Obviously, I'd like to see how they're going to get implemented on the PS4 and on the Xbone as well. But I thought it was a great breakdown of the Xbox 360 controller, which I'm going to talk about right now as well. Yes, I think the implementation of the analog sticks is the best on the 360 controller. This was the first controller, for my money, to not completely dish the D-pad NES world that we lived in before. It was the first one that said maybe we shouldn't, use that as the standard.